Hi, I'm here today talking to Senator David Fawcett, who is the chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. And we're discussing the recent report of the inquiry into the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for Australian foreign affairs, defence and trade. Thank you very much, Senator Fawcett, for making the time to talk
Pleasure.
to me today. I thought it would be interesting to start by you briefly summarising, please, what you identified personally as the main recommendations that came out of the report that you'd like to see actioned.
Sure. So I guess my overarching comment would be this is an inquiry about the implications or the lessons for Australia's foreign affairs, defence and trade policy from COVID. And the key takeout of that is that those lessons for those policy areas are not predominantly about health. That doesn't in any way underplay the significant impact this has had on individuals and their families who have had health impacts from COVID-19. But in terms of our foreign affairs, defence and trade policy, one of the key things it brings out is that many of our assumptions around foreign affairs, our relationship with other countries, around our defence, the security arrangements we have, how we expect other nations to behave and trade, are premised on an assumption that countries will abide by the global rules-based order, the norms that have enabled a great rise in cooperation and prosperity for many communities across the globe. And what we saw during COVID-19 was that when nations come under pressure, often they revert to quite nationalistic behaviour, and that has, during the pandemic, had impacts on commercial arrangements that have underpinned trade and the supply of some critical items for Australia. And potentially that behaviour, if demonstrated further during a conflict situation, could have impacts for Australia's security. And probably the third area that has led to a range of conclusions is that it has surprised many people just how long and complex some of our supply chains are, and how often the supply chains which have been driven by economic imperatives to be just-in-time replenishment at best market rates have actually led to exposure to single point failures, or in many cases, the actions of authoritarian governments, which can be quite coercive in nature. And that surprised a lot of people.
Thank you. Well, that actually segues very nicely into my first question, which was, as you said, the vulnerability of our supply chains. And the report recommends, and I quote here, that the government provide targeted support for Australian industry sectors which are involved in our critical national systems. And I was very heartened by the committee's decision to seek a slightly different balance between economics and security concerns than perhaps we'd seen in the past. And as you say, perhaps in the past we'd relied on assumptions that don't necessarily hold in a moment of crisis. In practical terms, what will this more interventionist role for the government in ensuring the security of our critical national systems involve?
So my starting premise would be that you do actually have to define critical national systems, because if we wanted government intervention in everything, that would almost be like a socialist command-driven economy, which would be unsustainable, unproductive, and Australia couldn't afford. And so you have to have a means of discriminating between what is a retail item or an item that may be of interest and demand to people, but it's not critical for the ongoing security of our nation or the operation of the systems that we think are important to making us a prosperous and free first world country. So our health system, for example, is a classic in that. And so that's probably a good example to use in the context of COVID to explain what this intervention may look like. So using personal protective equipment, or PPE, we saw the Italian health system come under quite some stress during COVID, because health workers, nurses and doctors and others were becoming sick at an alarming rate, many losing their lives. And that was because in large part in some hospitals, because of a lack of appropriate PPE, and particularly what they call P2 or P3 respirators. So these are not surgical masks, they're the masks that you wear that filter out the majority of viral elements that would cause you to become sick. And so the world clearly all raced out to try and procure stocks, and it became very hard to get hold of PPE, particularly the respirators. And so we saw Australia then reinvest both taxpayers' money and the private sector in resurrecting the ability to produce P2, P3 respirators. The risk is, as we come out of the pandemic, that people will try and return to business as usual, which is chasing the cheapest possible price, which will be inevitably an overseas supply chain. And without a sufficient level of demand, all of the taxpayers' money and private sector money that has gone into establishing a manufacturing capability and has kicked off, I might add, a degree of research and innovative development around the materials that enable us to produce things like P2, P3 respirators, that will atrophy to the point where those businesses will no longer be viable. And so for the government to say, health is a critical national system, one of the inputs is critical PPE, therefore we will look to make sure that we have sufficient aggregated demand in our procurement that we can say to Australian companies, we will buy from you in sufficient quantity with sufficient certainty that you can continue to invest in your research and development, your staff and your manufacturing capabilities so that Australia has a ongoing and scalable capability in PPE. So that's where it's a nuanced argument of saying, what are critical systems, what are the important inputs, and how do we provide support to Australian industry, not across the board, but in those areas that keep us a free and resilient first world nation.
That picks up on something. The next question is that I felt the report had quite a clear-eyed view of globalisation, and perhaps there's been a sense that the economics have often gone in front of the geopolitics when it came to globalisation, and some of the issues you've picked up on here about just-in-time processes and so forth. Looking forward, do you think that we will approach our international relations with a greater wariness about protecting our sovereignty, and what do you think that might look like in practice?
So I think the answer is unequivocally yes, not just because of COVID. COVID has brought a great focus on that, but also what we are seeing play out week by week at the moment is leading to that. In fact, a remarkable development last week was that Australia's ambassador to China, Graham Fletcher, came out and said that China has proven to be a vindictive and unreliable trade partner. Now, for the commercial sector who values certainty and security and importantly, the rule of law, whereby all parties, whether powerful or small, have equal access to a system that administers law fairly and in an unbiased manner. If they see a regime that rules by law, where coercive direction can be applied onto companies, which is not fair to other players, then they will start to reduce their direct investment and their degree of trade and exposure. And so certainly here in Australia, you're aware that we are currently going to the WTO over Bali. And after the announcement just last night, in fact, from the Chinese Communist Party around their treatment of Australia's wine sector, the measures they've announced, their claims of dumping and other things are clearly untrue, are not founded on any factual basis. And so the only interpretation you can place on it is that's a coercive attempt to use trade as a foreign policy lever. The wine industry is looking to find other markets. We will look at whether we take that to the WTO as well. So I think you see on the one hand, on the downside risk, we are already adapting, we are changing. On the upside, you see things like the critical minerals agreement between the United States and Australia, and that's potentially expanding some other nations where nations have identified that those supply chains for things like rare earths, critical minerals, which are so important for all of our technology, are very exposed to just a few nations. And so we're looking now to partner with the US to become a trusted supplier of not only the raw material, but also some of the processing. So the Australian company Linus has become a key part of that. And you see President Biden just in the last fortnight has signed executive orders requiring his administration to look into supply chains for critical things such as semiconductors, which go into whether it's the automotive sector, home electronics or defence. they're a critical input. And again, the supply chain is quite narrow and quite exposed to coercive control. And Australia has real opportunities. I mean, many people don't realise that here in Australia, if you have an iPhone, there's a good chance that the semiconductors are provided by an Australian company. We have an Australian company who is world-beating in terms of its technology and its pricing, and is one of Apple's largest suppliers. So, there's real opportunity there for us to step up into a range of these areas with other partners that we are looking to them for supply and they looking to us for supply. And both nations are characterised by the rule of law, which gives certainty to all the people who participate in that.
And building on that, I noticed in the report there's quite a few references to building our relationships with like-minded partners to shore up our supply chains. And I do agree with you, the actions of China are an example of the increasingly coercive measures that we're going to see below the level of conflict that are going to characterise the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, I think, in the forthcoming years. But at the same time, we are also seeing our like-minded partners are also at times disappointing us. And, we see this at the moment with the European Union, and it looks like India halting the export of the vaccines that we need. And I feel this very personally because I'm a Pacific scholar, and Papua New Guinea really needs vaccines at the moment. And Australia has, of course, undertaken that 1 million of ours will go there as soon as the EU provides them. And it's very acute, the need at the moment. But another example that has received quite a bit of attention over the last year or so has been our decision to locate our strategic fuel reserve in the US. Now, putting aside, I think it's difficult to see a case where the US would refuse to export that fuel reserve, but that reserve might be vulnerable in the event of a conflict or other coercive measures in the Pacific Ocean. Do you think the location of the strategic fuel reserve needs to be rethought?
Well, first off, I'd say we need to be careful of our terms. There are two pressures around fuel storage. One is the issue of what are Australia's fuel requirements strategically, and I've been a advocate for a long time. In fact, was part of the push within government to stand up the inquiry into Australia's fuel storage and fuel needs, particularly from not only a defence perspective, but our national resilience. Our ability to produce food requires diesel for all of the inputs of fertiliser and seed and harvesting and distribution, and aviation, where we rely hugely for the operation of our country on aviation fuel. So there's that. There's also then the IEA compliance, the 90-day requirement. And so there's two pressures there. The government has, over a number of years, taken some measures to bring us back into compliance with the IEA, and that can include what they call ticketing, which basically means we buy the right to get fuel from other people. We have a ticket, if you like. That's a very simplistic explanation. There's also been opportunistic purchases, and so the purchase that you're referring to here was that during COVID, because the demand for fuel went down, people were literally almost paying you to take the oil because the cost of storage were high. And so the government saw an opportunity to procure a large amount of oil and have it stored in the US at a very low cost. That's not our strategic fuel reserve. That's an opportunistic purchase, which helps with the IEA, but also, yes, we could potentially draw on. But you'll notice that in parallel, the government has launched a couple of initiatives here. One, an incentive to companies to continue refining in Australia. And that's really important because even in the last month, you've seen another refinery being slated for closure. But then there's the program for another 780 megalitres of diesel to be stored here in Australia as a strategic reserve. So there's both funding and planning underway to have onshore storage for diesel. And my argument continues to be that whilst diesel is critically important, we also need to consider aviation fuel from a commercial and defence perspective. We also need to look at reducing demand, and that's where I think hydrogen, particularly in the commercial heavy vehicle fleet, has a huge opportunity, as well as things like electric vehicles in our domestic domain. And the third area, I think, is we need to look at alternates to oil as a feedstock. And certainly there's a large amount of work going, not just with biodiesel for use in land vehicles, but also sustainable aviation fuel. And again, from a national security perspective, I see that it's really important that we develop the feedstock, the processing, and the certification and distribution networks so that it's a drop-in blend option, which is working day to day as part of business as usual, but can be scaled rapidly in event of a crisis. So whether it's a shipping container blocking the Suez Canal, whether it's interdiction of oil deliveries, whatever range of things might lead to it, we have an option, not only with more storage, but to supplement that storage with drop-ins, that we have the whole system proven and established and certified that we can scale when the requirement is there.
Now we move on. Now, you spoke earlier about the Rules-Based Order, and the Rules-Based Order is a key plank of Australian strategic and foreign policy. It appears multiple times in both recent defence and foreign policy white papers. In the report, it's primarily framed in terms of the economic aspects of the Rules-Based Order. Now, on one level, this is understandable because the report is focused on trade and supply chain resilience, which is primarily an economic question. But it does mean that some of the other aspects of the Rules-Based Order are overlooked, that they're important to our security. I noticed in the terms of reference for the committee, there was a inclusion of considering the impact of human rights, but this doesn't get a huge amount of coverage in the report. Does this reflect the interest of the submissions that were received? Did that shape the committee's agenda, or was there a conscious decision primarily to focus on the economic aspects of Rules-Based Order?
Combination of all three. Generally speaking, well, first off, committee reports have to reflect the evidence we've received. We can't just put our own personal view in and say this is the committee's report. It has to reflect that evidence. And so we tend to pick up on what were the consistent themes across a range of submitters that relate to the terms of reference. We did have, so we had Save the Children, we had World Vision, we had Human Rights Watch, the Australian Human Rights Commission. A number of groups spoke to us about human rights. And part of the judgment there, for example, some were calling for the government to bring in a Magnitsky-style sanctions regime. And the committee that I chair that produced this report was at the same time actually doing the work on a Magnitsky Act, which we tabled at a very similar time. So rather than put a recommendation in here, we actually tabled a whole report to that point. There were calls in terms of the Indo-Pacific and our Pacific neighbours in particular to find ways to shore up the Pacific worker, the labour mobility scheme, and the government had already implemented very specific measures on that. So there wasn't a lot of point in reporting on that. There were calls to step up and help our Pacific neighbours recover from COVID, and the government had actually taken the overseas development aid budget and a lot of programs which weren't able to be delivered because of the lack of mobility. We purposely reoriented that into a Partnerships for Recovery, which was very focused at the Southwest Pacific and countries like Timor-Leste to say how can we work with countries to actually help them recover. So many of the points that were raised were actually already in train quite specifically or were about to be reported by the committee. There were some other areas, for example, some of the port operators and Australian unions brought before us concerns about international labour obligations that we had for seafarers, some of whom, they normally spend a number of months every year on a ship. But if they were reaching toward the end of their contracted period, when all the COVID restrictions came in, some of those seafarers ended up being on ships for well over 12, 14 months. And there were a range of mental health and fatigue and performance issues associated with that. And so our report actually had two key recommendations in there. One was that we needed to make sure Australia had a way of meeting our ILO obligations and facilitating, albeit this was run by the states, and we had a very good exemplar in Queensland as to how it could be done, but to make sure that was nationally consistent so that we could enable crews to come in, their replacement crew to arrive, the changeover to occur, they could go back to their home country. And then a second recommendation related to that, which was we need to take that lesson, and this is kind of the thrust of the report, we need to take that lesson and say what's the framework we need so that in the event of a future crisis, whatever that be, if there are responsibilities that subnational governments, i.e. states and territories, have, how can we use new relationships like the National Cabinet to make sure that their decisions and practices and laws that apply to their state are consistent with our national obligations under human rights law? So, yes, we had evidence across a range of things, but for a range of reasons, some recommendations were prominent and others not so.
Yeah, of course, the Pacific's going to be covered by several committee reports coming up, presumably in the next few months too.
Yes,
so.
And in fact, I just signed off on one the other day.
Oh, well,
so
hopefully we'll be
on the streets very soon.
Hopefully we'll be back talking about that soon.
Yes.
Now, the report emphasises that our engagement with multilateral institutions will be guided by our national interest. And this has been a theme in a number of statements that both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have made over the last few years. And this does make sense. I mean, the government is mandated to pursue our national interest in its foreign policy. But by definition, multilateralism does require states to occasionally sacrifice some of their interests in pursuit of broader cooperation. But the report could be read as advocating that Australia is taking an increasingly narrow and selective approach to pursuing our national interests in these multilateral institutions. Is that your interpretation of the report? And if it is, what are we going to be able to do to reassure other states that we're willing to make the occasional sacrifices that are necessary for successful multilateralism? So,
a couple of points. One, the intent of the report is to recognise that, for example, the World Health Organization has a critical role to play in terms of COVID-19, and an earlier willingness to actually call it a pandemic and to put in place appropriate measures and to inquire into how it develops so that we don't repeat that mistake would have been a good thing for all of us. If multilateral institutions are not supported because people lack confidence in them, then two things happen. One, they're not funded properly, so they don't work as well. Secondly, you run the risk of nation states who don't share our plural, democratic, open, transparent view of how governance should work, starting to shape those multilateral institutions toward their worldview. And there's a very real risk, some people believe, in the whole area of the internet, that we'll see a bifurcation of people who believe in an open and transparent internet versus those who want to be able to apply censorship on that. In terms of the report and its recommendations, one view of multilateral institutions is that if you have a body like the UN, some people view them as like the supranational government that should be able to dictate to nations how we work. And I would classify that as a subordination to a multilateral body. The other view is that a multilateral body is a forum whereby nations of goodwill can come together to collaborate, and that's where you find nations saying, it's in our interest to compromise here, because by working collectively we will all get a better outcome, and us sacrificing this gets a better outcome. And that's an active collaboration in our interests as opposed to a subordination. And so I think the report is saying we can't allow the multilateral bodies to become so ineffective that they're dominated by people who shape them in a way that is not good for the world at large. And that goes back to this whole issue of rule of law as opposed to rule by law. And secondly, we need to make sure that our voice is heard in those bodies so that we are actively collaborating with people and saying what's in Australia's interest, which may include compromise, but it also includes, for example, making the World Trade Organization a more trusted and resilient body so that the global norms, the rules-based order around trade, people have the confidence to say, even in times of crisis, whether it be a pandemic or whether it be a conflict, we will seek to continue to support the global rules-based order because that enables all of us to get a better outcome.
I guess the thing is with multilateralism, though, is often what's in our interests is against the interests of other states. So I wonder in the narrative that has emerged in the last few years how helpful it is to be too explicit about the pursuit of our national interests. I wonder whether it might be better to be perhaps less less clearly articulating a desire to pursue our national interests might be helpful, but I guess time will tell. Now, I'm generally in favour of the report's recommendations. I've been screaming about supply chains for quite a while, and often you don't get a lot of hasn't been a lot of traction on that. I mean, I know myself. One of my children requires a medication that's entirely imported, and a few years ago there was a union blockade at the docks, and that medication couldn't get in for several months, and it was a very first-hand experience for me about how these vulnerabilities can impact your everyday life. And ourselves and other parents really saw that firsthand. So I'm very in favour of the new emphasis on this. One of my concerns is, though, that a lot of the report's recommendations are going to require substantial policy and economic investments by the government. Now, with the vaccine being rolled out and increasing talk about our borders opening and life returning to normal, how confident are you that there is the political will to implement the report's recommendations and that we'll be able to sustain that amongst the public as well?
So, as I mentioned previously with the PPE, one of the risks is that you'll see departments and officials saying, well, we're required to get the most cost-effective, lowest risk option, so we'll go back to an offshore supply chain. And so there is a risk of that occurring. I don't think there's any lack of political will, but I think there are three broad groupings here. There's the policy level, there's the process level, which from a government perspective is driven by the departments and the policy frameworks they have to operate under. And then there's the public demand, public perception, public willingness to perhaps say, yes, we think the government should spend a bit more there, or we're prepared to pay a slightly higher price, for example, for fuel, if they want fuel security, etc. And so part of the reason that, I've written the report with the committee, part of the reason I'm speaking to people like yourself and to many other think tanks and universities and industry groups and chambers of commerce between us and the UK and US and whoever else will have me, frankly, is to try and raise that awareness. This is something that we do need to do. And one of the specific recommendations you've seen in the report is that we need to tie the identification of a critical national system to our procurement process. I'm an experimental test pilot by professional background, and so my world has been shaped by systems engineering. And so you understand that nothing works in isolation, and you might see something that you think is the problem, but the symptoms may not actually represent the cause. Often you've got to dig a bit deeper. And so if you look at a number of things that have occurred over the last decade or so, where people have tried to say, why does the government spend all this money offshore? Why can't we have policies to say they should buy more locally and not have these extended supply chains? What is often the thing that stops that happening is not government intent, it's not the need, it's the process. And so the Commonwealth procurement rules, which are run by the Department of Finance, if you then have health or defence or other government departments, they have what we call accountable authority instructions, which use the Commonwealth procurement rules set by finance to guide how their desk officers can sign for contracts. And so part of the recommendation in this report is to say those Commonwealth procurement rules must be changed by the Department of Finance to recognise that there are some critical national systems that we have to have either onshore or we have to have trusted partners for, such that each of the departments can then go, yes, I'm now buying widget A, and widget A feeds into that critical national system, and the procurement rules and my departmental guidelines that are drawn from them recognise that that's a national priority and that it represents value for money, for me to say that this individual project can be part of a program of activities which is aiming to build over time, perhaps over a 5-year period, to a level of national capability that the government says for this area is important. So if you're buying photocopying paper, for example, that wouldn't apply. It's a low barrier to entry that's easy to replace with other products if we need it. So one of the key elements is to look at changing the Commonwealth procurement rules, which are run by the Department of Finance, because those rules guide what departmental officials in health or defence are able to do. They have what we call accountable authority instructions that give the desk officers their guidelines as to what's legal for them to do. So we need the procurement rules to explicitly acknowledge that there are some things which are critical to our national systems like health and defence, and to allow the desk officer in those other departments to say that this project is linked to that critical national system and it plays a part in a program of activities to build sovereign capability. And so there's value for money recognised by the procurement rules in that project officer saying, look, the Australian mask manufacturer might charge 5 cents per mask more today, but we know that if over 5 years' time we keep them sustainable, the innovation that is already underway to replace things like spunbond, which is the melt-blown product that forms the filtering ability of the mask, we now have innovative efforts in Australia to make a better product cheaper than what's available overseas. So in 5 years' time, we would not only potentially have a sovereign capability, but we would have better masks cheaper than we can buy them. But at the moment, our procurement rules don't recognise that as value for money. And so the report is very explicitly saying we have to make that change and linkage between the procurement rules and the people at the desk.
Thank you. Well, you've already foreshadowed some of the steps that I was going to ask you about in my next question, but what do you foresee are the next steps required for implementation? You've spoken there about the public sector steps. Are there other steps in the private sector that are going to be engaged in? And also, is there going to be a public information campaign? Because I know myself, I mean, this is my job, but I even found some of the statistics and information in the report quite alarming, especially in relation to our food security. I think a lot of people know that we are an exporter of food, that we produce a surplus, but they don't realise how reliant our food production is on supply chains of fertiliser and other agricultural goods. What are the next steps that you see for implementing the report, please?
So part of what the report is calling for is for the government to have a whole of government, in fact, whole of nation approach to this. First step is whole of government across the federal government, all the various departments, to the extent we can get agreement with the states to extend that to state governments, and then to the private sector. And what's required is that a number of the activities that are already underway in what I call silos are actually brought together, so that rather than having one group looking at critical infrastructure just in terms of the buildings and another group, so that's Home Affairs, they have a critical infrastructure centre. There's another group within Defence that started work on an assessment of critical health countermeasures in a military application. That's now developed into a broader discussion around things like PPE. But they're two examples of efforts that are kind of in parallel but are not necessarily coordinated, and we need to make sure we have a whole of government effort so that we come up with that national definition of what our critical national systems are. Then there's a part where we need the private sector to be involved, to say, having identified those critical national systems, where do their supply chains go? So pharmaceuticals is a great example. A lot of people say we have diversity in pharmaceuticals because we get pharmaceuticals from China, we get pharmaceuticals from India, there's a range of nations who make them. But when you dig down the supply chain, a lot of the precursor chemicals come from one place, one city in China. And the US in particular has been very public about its alarm at how exposed it is. The Henry Jackson Society, who we quote in the report in the UK, did an analysis of just how exposed in a range of critical areas the Five Eyes nations are. And so once we've identified where those supply chains go, if there are single point failures or if there's exposure to that coercive control, then we need to work with the private sector to understand how we shift that supply line to either a trusted partner or to a sovereign capability, and how the government and the private sector work together. So that's where I'm certainly having discussions internal to the government as well as externally to keep the conversation going so that people don't have sort of COVID-19 fatigue and say, well, thank goodness we're past 2020, let's move back to life as normal. But to say, we understand that life as normal, that business as usual isn't an option if we want to be resilient into the future, and to be prepared to have those discussions, establish those partnerships to make sure that Australia really can be the resilient, globally engaged nation that we all expect and want it to be.
Well, thank you very much. There's certainly a lot in the report that I think will stand the test of time, and it's been a very welcome, as I said before, highlighting our vulnerabilities that sometimes have been overlooked. So I very much appreciate you giving us your time today to talk, and
Pleasure.
look forward to talking again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.